All right, let's jump right into this explainer and unpack a truly fascinating document. It's a text that attempts to philosophically deduce exactly why Islam is the true religion. And look, whether you're super well-versed in theology or you're just kind of curious about how different faiths structure their big truth claims, this source material offers a highly systematic argument. We are going to walk through exactly how the author constructs this case, relying strictly on their logical framework, their structured process of elimination, and the very specific scriptural evidence they've laid out for us.
Now, the author kicks things off by tackling a really common question head-on. What is the actual basis for this profound sense of certainty that Muslims display regarding their faith? I mean, it's a debate as old as Islam itself, right? Why do followers of this religion claim that the truth belongs to them alone and that anyone who differs has somehow failed to grasp it? The text totally acknowledges that, from an Islamic perspective, the ultimate answer is usually found directly in the Qur'an. But for the sake of this specific argument, the author decides to take a completely different, purely logical route to answer that question.
To see exactly how they answer it, we're going to follow the text's structured process of elimination through 6 key sections: the claim to truth, the perfect creator principle, evaluating Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Sikhism, the critique of Judaism, and finally, the Islamic conclusion.
Starting with Section 1, the claim to truth, searching for a fundamental pillar.
So before evaluating any specific beliefs, the text lays down a strict ground rule. It actually completely bypasses your standard theological debates. Arguments over scriptural contradictions, historical additions, or mythological elements, because it views all of that as secondary. Instead, it zeroes right in on what it considers the absolute baseline, the concept of God. The author posits that the way a religion defines God is its most fundamental pillar. Therefore, that's literally the only logical place to begin a truly comprehensive comparative evaluation.
The source material lays out its very first premise here, arguing that pure reason absolutely necessitates a universe with a creator. Drawing on a broad agreement between classical and modern philosophers, logicians, and thinkers, the text argues that the sheer precision, the order, and the harmony of the universe point directly and undeniably to a maker. It's like a giant cosmic clockwork that demands a clockmaker.
Moving into Section 2, the perfect creator principle, establishing the litmus test.
This right here is the main philosophical criteria the author is going to rigorously apply to every major faith throughout the rest of the document. It's all about this definition of absolute perfection. According to the text, the creator of such a brilliantly ordered universe must possess absolute perfection. Any deficiency would mean the creator is subject to limitation and decline, which breaks the definition of a creator. Furthermore, a key attribute of this perfection is absolute oneness. The logic presented here is that if a creator somehow needed support, or if there was an equal opposing force, well, neither would be truly perfect, right? They would be defined by their limitations. The author argues that if multiple creators existed, each would naturally claim authority over their own creations, inevitably leading to massive conflict and the complete catastrophic collapse of the cosmic order. Therefore, the true God must be completely singular and entirely independent.
Which brings us to Section 3, Evaluating Christianity, the Test of Pure Unity.
Armed with this highly specific, rational litmus test of a single, perfect, independent creator, the text starts evaluating the world's religions, kicking off with the absolute largest. The document points out that Christianity approaches 2.5 billion followers. However, it quickly tosses in a sociological observation, asserting that the number of actively practicing individuals is far smaller. It notes many identify culturally rather than religiously and claims that churches are often sparsely attended compared to, say, large Friday mosque congregations. But listen, the core critique here isn't about attendance, it's purely theological.
The author actually eliminates Christianity based on their criteria, arguing that the Christian conception of God lacks pure unity. They do this by mapping out this timeline of human limitations and historical shifts in doctrine. The text argues that the concept of the Trinity, 3 in 1 or 1 in 3, and the idea of God having a literal son directly violates their absolute perfection rule. The author highlights the belief that this divine figure was carried in a womb for 9 months, was born like a human, and lived for 33 years subjected to everyday human experiences, torture, and eventually a humiliating crucifixion. A perfect God, the text argues, must be entirely above such physical limitations. On top of that, the document claims that early Christians who actually affirmed pure monotheism were actively suppressed and condemned as heretics, particularly after the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE. Because of this historical departure from pure divine unity, the author states Christianity absolutely must be excluded from the running.
Next up is Section 4, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Sikhism, a rapid elimination.
The explainer rapidly applies that exact same litmus test of a single, sovereign creator to three other major world religions. First, the text argues that Hinduism, despite having well over 1 billion adherents, is excluded right off the bat because its multiplicity of gods directly violates the oneness test. Buddhism, with its hundreds of millions of followers, is excluded because, according to the author, it presents more of a philosophical and ethical system, rather than affirming a single sovereign creator in the conventional sense. Finally, Sikhism is dismissed from consideration by the author, who labels it a relatively recent synthesis of traditions, rather than an original, uncorrupted revelation from God.
Section 5. The Critique of Judaism. Theological Clashes.
Here, the author turns a really critical eye toward Judaism, dedicating a massive chunk of the text to arguing that its scriptures completely fail that perfection test. Now, while fully acknowledging that Judaism firmly affirms the belief in one God, the document argues its historical narratives consistently portray God with severe human deficiencies. The text claims the Judaic depiction of God often resembles a human being, lacking knowledge of the unseen, experiencing fear, and reacting with physical limitation. Specifically, the author points to the narrative of Adam. They suggest that in these traditions, God forbade Adam from eating from the tree of knowledge out of fear that Adam might become immortal and actually threaten God's own dominion. For the author, this implies a God who isn't fully aware of or in control of the consequences of his own creation.
And this part brilliantly shows off the author's methodology. We start seeing the original text use highly specific verses from the Qur'an to directly refute these perceived Judaic deficiencies. By placing these texts side by side, the author attempts to show exactly how Islam's scripture actively corrects what it views as the fundamental flaws in older traditions.
For instance, let's look at the Judaic idea that God experienced fatigue after creating the world and literally required rest on the seventh day. To counter this, the author quotes Qur'an chapter 50, verse 38. The verse explicitly states that the heavens and earth were created in 6 days and, quote, nothing of fatigue touched us. It's a firm assertion of absolute divine stamina, completely rejecting any notion of physical limitation or exhaustion.
The text also brings up claims that Judaic narratives describe God as poor while the people themselves are rich. To aggressively counter that, the author immediately brings in Qur'an chapter 3, verse 181, which addresses and directly condemns this exact statement. This is used to further reinforce the strict Islamic view of God's absolute independence and total lack of need.
The document just continues this pattern of theological refutation, which brings us to the final page of our source material, where the author wraps up their critique of Judaism before moving on to their ultimate conclusion.
The author points to descriptions of God being miserly or his hand being restrained, quoting Qur'an chapter 5, verse 64. The text even goes so far as to claim that Judaic narratives portray God as being susceptible to deception. The author concludes this whole section by stating that altogether, these human-like portrayals completely and utterly contradict the absolute perfection principle established at the very beginning of the text, rendering such a depicted being unworthy of worship.
Finally, Section 6, the Islamic conclusion, the last religion standing.
Having systematically crossed off the other major faiths based on this highly specific philosophical framework, we finally arrive at the author's ultimate conclusion. With nearly 2 billion adherents and a rapidly growing presence worldwide, Islam is presented by the text as the absolute only religion left standing after this strict analysis. The author concludes that only Islam's conception of God perfectly aligns with their rational principle. It stands in stark contrast to the limitations, multiple creators, or human deficiencies they attributed to literally all the other faiths. Islam, they argue, presents a God defined by absolute perfection. The text emphasizes that in Islam, God is entirely one, without any partner, without any need, and without limitation. And crucially, the author notes this isn't even a matter of theological dispute among Muslims. It is a foundational, unshakable certainty that is consistent across all its diverse schools and global communities.
To back up this philosophical claim, the document ends by observing a sociological trend. The author notes that a significant number of scholars and deep thinkers from other religious backgrounds actually embrace Islam after careful, rigorous study. But in stark contrast, they argue, it is exceptionally difficult to find a well-documented case of a Muslim scholar leaving Islam for another religion on the basis of that same kind of rigorous intellectual inquiry.
Which leaves us with the author's final, pretty provocative thought. If you accept this strict definition of absolute perfection, and you observe this pattern among scholars, what conclusion must a fair-minded observer logically draw? It's a bold, highly structured argument that uses a singular philosophical lens to view the entire landscape of world religions. And look, whether you agree with the underlying premise or not, it clearly illustrates exactly why the author believes the ultimate truth belongs to Islam alone.
سنريهم آياتنا في الآفاق وفي أنفسهم حتى يتبين لهم أنه الحق أولم يكف بربك أنه على كل شيء شهيد